The autumn of 1743 brought an unusual chill to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where the Whitmore family had established their modest homestead on the outskirts of Salem Village. Ezekiel Whitmore, a man of 35 years with calloused hands and eyes that burned with religious fervor, stood before his wife Mercy in their candlelit parlor. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the wooden walls, creating an atmosphere that seemed to mirror the darkness growing within their hearts. "The prophet has spoken to me again," Ezekiel announced, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority that had become all too familiar to Mercy. She sat in her wooden chair, her hands folded over her swollen belly, her fourth pregnancy in 6 years. The previous 3 children had all been taken from her arms before their second birthdays, delivered to the mysterious settlement known as New Zion, hidden deep in the untamed forests of western Massachusetts. Mercy's fingers trembled as she traced the rough fabric of her woolen dress. The autumn wind howled through the gaps in their log cabin walls, but the cold she felt came from within. What does he require of us this time, husband?" Ezekiel approached her slowly, his boots creaking against the wooden floorboards. The smell of tallow candles mixed with the lingering aroma of their meager supper, boiled turnips and salted pork. "Brother Josiah has received another vision. The Lord demands more vessels for his holy work. This child," he placed his rough hand on her belly, "and the ones to follow, they are not ours to keep. They belong to the kingdom of heaven, to be shaped by the prophet's divine wisdom." The fire in the hearth crackled, sending sparks up the chimney as Mercy closed her eyes. She remembered her first child, little Samuel, with his bright blue eyes and infectious laughter. The day they took him, he had cried for her, reaching his tiny arms back toward their cabin as Brother Josiah's men carried him away into the forest. That was 3 years ago, and she had heard nothing of him since. "The other families in the village," Mercy whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "They speak in hushed tones about us. They say we are cursed, that we give our children to the devil himself." Ezekiel's hand tightened on her shoulder, his grip firm but not yet painful. "Let them speak their ignorance. They know nothing of the sacred covenant we have entered. Brother Josiah has shown us the path to eternal salvation. Our children will be raised in perfect holiness, free from the corruption of this sinful world. They will serve the prophet directly, becoming instruments of God's will on earth." Through the small window, Mercy could see the lights of Salem Village twinkling in the distance. Normal families were gathering around their hearths, telling stories to children who would sleep in their own beds, wake to their mothers' faces, and grow up knowing the warmth of parental love. The contrast made her heart ache with a pain so deep it felt like a physical wound. "But Ezekiel," she ventured carefully, knowing how her husband's temper could flare when his faith was questioned, "what if the Lord intended for us to raise our own children? What if this separation is not his will, but the will of men who seek to use our devotion for their own purposes?" The silence that followed was deafening. Ezekiel's breathing grew heavy, and Mercy could feel the tension radiating from his body. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge that made her blood run cold. "You dare question the prophet's divine revelations. You dare suggest that Brother Josiah, who speaks directly with the Almighty, is deceiving us?" His hand moved from her shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, but resting there as a clear threat. "Perhaps your condition has addled your mind, wife. Perhaps you need to spend more time in prayer and contemplation." "Blah." Mercy's heart raced as she felt the weight of his hand against her neck. She had learned over the years to recognize the signs of his growing anger, the way his jaw tightened and his eyes took on a glassy, distant look. "Forgive me, husband. The burden of carrying this child has made me weak in faith. I will pray for strength and understanding." Ezekiel's grip relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. "Tomorrow, we will travel to New Zion for the monthly gathering. Brother Josiah wishes to examine you, to ensure the child you carry is developing properly for the Lord's service. You will submit to his inspection with gratitude and humility." The thought of Brother Josiah's hands on her body made Mercy's stomach turn, but she nodded obediently. She had endured his examinations before, sessions that felt more like violations than medical assessments. The prophet claimed he could determine a child's spiritual potential while still in the womb, but Mercy suspected his true motivations were far more earthly and sinister. As the night deepened and Ezekiel retired to his prayers, Mercy remained by the dying fire, her hands protectively covering her unborn child. She thought of the other women in their small religious community: Sarah Blackwood, who had borne 7 children for the prophet; Rebecca Mills, whose twin daughters had been taken when they were barely walking; and poor Hannah Prescott, who had died in childbirth after her 5th pregnancy, her body finally unable to bear the constant cycle of conception and separation. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the shutters and sending a chill through the cabin that seemed to penetrate her very soul. Somewhere in the darkness of the Massachusetts wilderness, her 3 children were living lives she could only imagine, shaped by the hands of a man who claimed to speak for God, but whose actions spoke of something far more sinister. As she finally rose to join her husband in their bed, Mercy whispered a silent prayer, not to Brother Josiah's vengeful deity, but to the loving God she remembered from her childhood, before fear and fanaticism had poisoned her faith. She prayed for her children's safety, for the strength to endure what was to come, and for the courage to one day break free from the chains of false prophecy that bound her family to a fate worse than death. The candles guttered out one by one, plunging the cabin into darkness, but the shadows that haunted the Whitmore family ran far deeper than any absence of light could create. The journey to New Zion began before dawn, with Ezekiel loading their meager possessions into a wooden cart pulled by their aging mare, Patience. The November morning was bitter cold, with frost covering the ground like a shroud of crystalline tears. Mercy wrapped herself in her heaviest woolen cloak, but the chill seemed to seep through every layer of clothing, settling deep in her bones. The path to New Zion was barely more than a deer trail, winding through dense forests of oak and pine that blocked out most of the pale morning sun. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, the familiar sounds of civilization, church bells, children's laughter, the calls of merchants, faded into an oppressive silence, broken only by the creaking of their cartwheels and the occasional cry of a crow overhead. "Remember," Ezekiel said, as they approached a crude wooden gate marked with strange symbols carved deep into the timber. "You are to speak only when spoken to. Brother Josiah's time is precious, and he does not suffer the idle chatter of women gladly." Mercy nodded, though her eyes were fixed on the symbols adorning the gate. They resembled no Christian iconography she had ever seen: twisted spirals, interlocking triangles, and what appeared to be human figures in positions of submission. The sight of them made her unborn child stir restlessly in her womb, as if even the innocent life within her could sense the wrongness of this place. 2 men emerged from a small guardhouse, both dressed in rough brown robes tied with rope belts. Their heads were shaved, and their faces bore the gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance of those who had embraced extreme asceticism. One of them, a man Mercy recognized as Thomas Hartwell, a former neighbor who had joined the prophet's inner circle 2 years prior, approached their cart with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. "Brother Ezekiel," Thomas said, his voice carrying an odd sing-song quality that hadn't been there before his conversion, "the prophet awaits your arrival. Sister Mercy." His eyes lingered on her pregnant form with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You are to be prepared for the sacred examination immediately upon your arrival." As they passed through the gate, Mercy got her first clear view of New Zion in daylight. The settlement consisted of perhaps 20 rough-hewn buildings, arranged in a circular pattern around a larger central structure that served as both meeting house and the prophet's residence. The buildings were utilitarian and stark, lacking any decoration or comfort that might suggest human warmth or joy. What struck her most forcefully, however, was the absence of children's voices. In any normal settlement of this size, there should have been dozens of young ones playing in the common areas, their laughter and shouts filling the air. Instead, New Zion was eerily quiet, populated only by adults who moved about their tasks with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers. "Where are the children?" Mercy whispered to her husband, unable to contain her growing anxiety. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "They are being educated in the sacred mysteries, away from the corrupting influences of the outside world. Brother Josiah has established a special sanctuary for their spiritual development." A woman approached their cart, Sister Abigail, whom Mercy remembered as a cheerful baker's wife from Salem village before her transformation. Now, her once plump face was gaunt and marked by deep lines of exhaustion. Her eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of unspeakable experiences. "Sister Mercy," Abigail said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you are to come with me for purification before meeting with the prophet. Brother Ezekiel, you will join the men in the meeting house for evening prayers." Mercy was led to a small, windowless building that reeked of lye soap and something else, a sickly sweet odor that reminded her of decay. Inside, several other women waited in various stages of undress, their bodies showing the telltale signs of recent childbirth or advanced pregnancy. None of them met her eyes, and the silence was so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. "Remove your clothing," Abigail instructed, her voice devoid of emotion. "The prophet must examine you without the barrier of worldly garments. Your body belongs to the Lord now, and modesty is a sin when it interferes with his divine will." As Mercy reluctantly disrobed, she noticed the other women bore strange markings on their skin, small scars in geometric patterns that looked deliberately inflicted. When she asked about them, Abigail's face went pale. "Those are the marks of consecration," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "The prophet brands his chosen vessels to ensure their purity and dedication. You will receive yours after the examination if you are deemed worthy." The door to the building suddenly swung open, and Brother Josiah entered with the commanding presence of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. He was tall and lean, with piercing gray eyes and prematurely white hair that fell to his shoulders. His face bore the kind of austere handsomeness that might have been appealing under different circumstances, but there was something predatory in his gaze that made Mercy's skin crawl. "Sister Mercy," he said, his voice smooth as honey, but with an underlying current of steel, "how blessed we are to welcome another vessel into our sacred fold. The Lord has spoken to me of the child you carry, a daughter destined for great service in his kingdom." Josiah approached her slowly, his eyes never leaving her naked form. "Lie down on the table," he commanded, gesturing to a rough wooden surface covered with a stained cloth. "I must confirm what the Almighty has revealed to me in my visions." As Mercy reluctantly complied, she noticed that the other women had formed a circle around the table, their faces blank and expressionless. Josiah's hands were cold as they moved over her body, his touch lingering in ways that had nothing to do with medical examination and everything to do with dominance and control. "Yes," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear, "I can feel the divine spark within this child. She will be beautiful, strong, and perfectly suited for the sacred rituals that bind our community to the heavenly realm. You have done well, Sister Mercy. Your womb has proven itself a worthy vessel for the Lord's purposes." The examination continued for what felt like hours, with Josiah's hands exploring every inch of her body while he spoke in tongues and claimed to receive divine revelations about her unborn daughter's future. The other women watched in silence, their eyes reflecting a mixture of sympathy and resignation that spoke of their own similar experiences. When it was finally over, Josiah stepped back with a satisfied smile. "This child will be taken from you at birth," he announced matter-of-factly. "She is too precious to risk contamination by maternal attachment. You will nurse her for exactly 1 month, then surrender her to my care for proper spiritual education." Mercy's heart shattered at these words, but she had learned not to protest openly. Instead, she nodded submissively while tears streamed down her face. "As the Lord wills," she whispered, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. As she was led away to receive her mark of consecration, a small brand burned into the flesh of her shoulder, Mercy caught a glimpse through a partially open door of what lay beyond the main settlement. In the distance, she could see another cluster of buildings surrounded by a high wooden fence. Even from this distance, she could hear the faint sound of children crying, a sound that was quickly muffled as someone slammed the door shut. That night, as she lay on a straw mattress in the women's dormitory, listening to the muffled sobs of her fellow sisters, Mercy finally understood the true nature of the covenant her family had entered. They were not serving God. They were feeding a monster that wore the mask of divine authority while consuming the innocence of children and the souls of their parents. The brand on her shoulder throbbed with pain, but it was nothing compared to the agony in her heart as she realized that her unborn daughter was already lost to her, destined to become another victim in Brother Josiah's twisted kingdom of false salvation. 3 months had passed since Mercy's examination at New Zion, and the winter of 1744 had proven to be one of the harshest in recent memory. Snow lay thick on the ground around the Whitmore cabin, and the bitter cold seemed to seep through every crack in the walls. Mercy's pregnancy had progressed normally, but her spirit had withered like a flower touched by frost. On a particularly brutal February morning, Mercy's labor began with a violence that seemed to mirror the storm raging outside. Ezekiel had summoned Sister Abigail and 2 other women from New Zion to assist with the birth, as Brother Josiah had decreed that all children born to his followers must enter the world under the supervision of his chosen midwives. The labor lasted 18 agonizing hours, during which Mercy drifted in and out of consciousness, her fevered mind filled with nightmarish visions of her children calling out to her from some dark, unreachable place. When her daughter finally emerged into the world, the infant's first cry was strong and clear, cutting through the howling wind like a blade of pure sound. "She is perfect," Sister Abigail announced, holding the baby up for inspection. "Brother Josiah will be pleased. This one has the mark of divine favor upon her." Mercy reached out with trembling arms to hold her daughter, and for one precious moment she was allowed to cradle the tiny life against her chest. The baby had Ezekiel's dark hair, but Mercy's green eyes. And when she looked up at her mother, Mercy felt a connection so profound it seemed to transcend the physical world. "Her name," Mercy whispered. "I want to name her Hope." Sister Abigail's face hardened. "The prophet will choose her name when she is brought to the sanctuary. Earthly names are meaningless for those destined to serve the divine will." True to Brother Josiah's decree, Mercy was allowed exactly 1 month to nurse her daughter before the inevitable separation. Those 30 days passed like a fever dream, with Mercy treasuring every moment, every feeding, every soft breath against her chest, every tiny finger wrapped around her own. She sang lullabies her own mother had taught her, whispered stories of the world beyond New Zion, and made promises she knew she could never keep. On the appointed day, Brother Josiah himself arrived at the Whitmore cabin, accompanied by 2 of his most trusted followers. The prophet's presence seemed to fill the small space with an oppressive energy that made the very air feel thick and difficult to breathe. "Sister Mercy," he said, his voice carrying that same honey-smooth tone that barely concealed his underlying cruelty. "The time has come for your daughter to begin her true education. You have served your purpose as a vessel, and now you must surrender what was never truly yours to begin with." Mercy clutched her baby closer, her maternal instinct screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything rather than hand over her child to this man. But she knew the consequences of resistance. Other women who had tried to keep their children had simply disappeared, along with their infants, never to be seen again. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face, "let me visit her. Let me see that she's well cared for. I won't interfere with her education. I just need to know she is safe." Brother Josiah's smile was cold as winter frost. "Your attachment is precisely why she must be removed from your influence. Maternal love is a weakness that corrupts the soul and interferes with divine purpose. She will be raised to know only the love of the Almighty, pure and untainted by earthly sentiment." With a gesture from the prophet, one of his men stepped forward and took the baby from Mercy's arms. Her daughter began to cry, a sound that tore through Mercy's heart like a physical wound. As they carried her away, Mercy collapsed to her knees, her anguished sobs echoing through the cabin. "Be strong, wife," Ezekiel said, though his own voice shook with suppressed emotion. "We have done the Lord's work. Our sacrifice will be rewarded in the kingdom of heaven." But Mercy was beyond comfort. As the sound of the departing cart faded into the distance, she felt something inside her break, not just her heart, but her very soul. The woman who had once believed in the goodness of God and the possibility of redemption was dying, replaced by someone harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous. Days turned into weeks, and Mercy found herself consumed by thoughts of her children. Late at night, when Ezekiel was deep in sleep, she would slip out of their cabin and walk to the edge of their property, staring into the dark forest that concealed New Zion. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, she thought she could hear the distant sound of children crying. It was during one of these midnight vigils that she encountered Jacob Thornfield, a trapper who had been working the forests around New Zion for the past several months. Jacob was a weathered man in his 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded Mercy of her father. Unlike the other men in the area, he showed no fear or reverence when speaking of Brother Josiah and his followers. "You're one of them religious folk, ain't you?" he asked, approaching her carefully as she stood at the forest's edge. "The ones who give their young'uns to that preacher man?" Mercy nodded, unable to trust her voice. Jacob studied her face in the moonlight, and she saw something like pity in his expression. "I've been setting traps in these woods for nigh on 6 months now," he said quietly. "I've seen things, heard things that ain't natural. That place you folks call New Zion, it ain't what it appears to be." "What do you mean?" Mercy whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. Jacob glanced around nervously before continuing. "There's buildings back there, hidden deep in the woods where nobody's supposed to go. I've seen children, dozens of them, but they ain't being educated like you might think. They're being used for things that would make the devil himself weep." Mercy's blood turned to ice. "My children, my babies. I'm sorry, ma'am. I truly am. But if you want to know the truth about what's happening to your little ones, you need to see for yourself. I can show you a way into that place, but I warn you, what you see might destroy what's left of your faith in humanity." The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge. Mercy knew that learning the truth about her children's fate might drive her to madness, but the not knowing was already killing her by degrees. She thought of her daughter's trusting green eyes, of her sons who had been taken before they could even speak their first words. "Show me," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Whatever the cost, I need to know." Jacob nodded grimly. "Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, meet me here and dress warmly. We'll be traveling through rough country, and what we're going to do will take most of the night." As Mercy returned to her cabin, she felt a strange sense of purpose settling over her like a mantle. For the first time in years, she was going to take action rather than simply endure. Whatever horrors awaited her in the hidden depths of New Zion, she would face them with her eyes open. The truth, no matter how terrible, had to be better than the lies that had consumed her life. And if her children were suffering as Jacob suggested, then perhaps it was time for a mother's love to prove stronger than a prophet's false promises. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the trees and carrying with it the faint sound of children's voices. Not crying this time, but singing in harmony, their innocent voices twisted into something that sounded more like a funeral dirge than a hymn of praise. The following night arrived with a bone-chilling clarity that made every star visible in the black sky above. Mercy had spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, going through the motions of her daily routine while her mind raced with possibilities of what she might discover. Ezekiel had noticed her distraction, but attributed it to the lingering effects of childbirth and grief. As the household settled into sleep, Mercy slipped from her bed and dressed in her warmest clothing. She had told Ezekiel she was suffering from insomnia and would spend the night in prayer by the fireplace, a lie that came easier than she had expected. The woman she was becoming seemed to have fewer qualms about deception than the obedient wife she had once been. Jacob was waiting for her at the forest's edge, carrying a small lantern with its light carefully shielded. He had brought additional supplies, rope, a sharp knife, and what appeared to be a small vial of some dark liquid. "That's lamp oil mixed with pine resin," he explained when he noticed her questioning look. "If we need to create a distraction or... well, let's hope it doesn't come to that." They moved through the forest with the stealth of experienced hunters, following deer paths and creek beds that would mask their footprints. Jacob seemed to know every tree and stone in these woods, guiding them around the main settlement of New Zion toward the hidden buildings he had mentioned. After nearly 2 hours of careful travel, they reached a ridge overlooking a valley that Mercy had never known existed. Below them, illuminated by torches and braziers, stood a complex of buildings that dwarfed the main settlement. The architecture was different here, older, more elaborate, with strange symbols carved into every visible surface. "Sweet Jesus," Mercy whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "How many children are down there?" Jacob pointed to a large building at the center of the complex. "That's where most of them are kept. I've counted at least 50 young ones, ranging from infants to teenagers." "But Mercy," his voice grew heavy with sorrow, "you need to prepare yourself for what we're going to see. These children ain't being raised for any godly purpose." They descended into the valley, using a narrow game trail, moving from shadow to shadow as they approached the perimeter of the hidden compound. The first thing Mercy noticed was the smell, a mixture of unwashed bodies, fear, and something else that made her stomach turn. It was the scent of despair made manifest. The building Jacob had indicated was constructed like a prison, with barred windows set high in the walls and only one visible entrance, heavily guarded by 2 men in the brown robes of Brother Josiah's inner circle. But Jacob led her around to the back of the structure, where a small drainage culvert provided access beneath the foundation. "I've been through here before," he whispered as they crawled through the narrow tunnel. "There's a storage room that connects to the main dormitory. We can see everything from there without being spotted." The storage room was filled with supplies that made Mercy's blood run cold, chains, shackles, and implements that could only be described as instruments of torture. But it was the children's clothing piled in one corner that nearly broke her resolve. Tiny garments stained with blood and tears, mute testimony to unspeakable suffering. Through a crack in the wall, they could see into the main dormitory. What Mercy witnessed there would haunt her for the rest of her days. Dozens of children, ranging in age from toddlers to adolescents, were arranged in rows of crude beds. Many bore visible signs of abuse. Bruises, cuts, and the hollow-eyed look of those who had endured trauma beyond their ability to comprehend. But it was the sight of the older children that truly horrified her. Teenage girls, some barely past childhood themselves, were clearly pregnant. They moved with the careful, protective gestures of expectant mothers, but their faces showed none of the joy that should accompany new life. Instead, they looked like prisoners awaiting execution. "Dear God," Mercy breathed. "They're breeding them like livestock." Jacob nodded grimly. Brother Josiah calls it expanding the sacred bloodline. The boys are trained to be his enforcers, and the girls, well, you can see for yourself what happens to the girls. As they watched, a door at the far end of the dormitory opened, and Brother Josiah himself entered, accompanied by several of his male followers. The children immediately cowered, pressing themselves against the walls as if trying to disappear entirely. The prophet moved among them like a predator, selecting prey, his hands touching and examining the children with a casual possessiveness that made Mercy's skin crawl. "Tonight, we celebrate the sacred union," Josiah announced, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Sister Patience," he gestured to a girl who couldn't have been more than 14, "you have been chosen to receive the divine seed. Your body will become a vessel for the next generation of the faithful." The girl began to sob, but two of Josiah's men grabbed her arms and began dragging her toward a door marked with the same twisted symbols Mercy had seen on the main gate. Other children watched in silent terror, knowing that any one of them could be next. Mercy felt something snap inside her chest, not breaking this time, but hardening into something sharp and deadly. This was what had happened to her children. What was happening to her infant daughter even now? The sacred education was nothing more than systematic abuse designed to create a generation of victims who would never know any life beyond this nightmare. "I've seen enough," she whispered to Jacob, but her voice carried a new quality, cold, determined, and utterly without mercy. "We need to get these children out of here." Jacob grabbed her arm. "Mercy, there's 50 of them and only 2 of us. We can't." "Then we get help," she interrupted. "There are other families in Salem Village who have lost children to this monster. Parents who would fight to save their babies if they knew the truth." But as they prepared to leave, Mercy caught sight of a small figure in the far corner of the dormitory. Even in the dim light, she recognized the dark hair and delicate features of her 3-year-old son Samuel. He was thin and pale, his once bright eyes now dull with the kind of trauma that aged children beyond their years. The sight of him gave her the strength she needed to turn away and begin planning her revenge. Brother Josiah had taken everything from her, her children, her faith, her innocence, but he had made one crucial mistake. He had left her alive, and a mother's love, when twisted by grief and rage, could become the most dangerous force in the world. As they crawled back through the drainage tunnel and began their journey home, Mercy was already formulating a plan. She would gather the other parents, show them the truth about New Zion, and together they would bring down the false prophet who had destroyed so many lives. The woman who had entered the forest that night as a broken victim emerged as something far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Brother Josiah's reign of terror was about to face its greatest challenge, and Mercy Whitmore would not rest until every child in that hellish compound was free. The stars above seemed to burn brighter as she made her silent vow, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness to her transformation from victim to avenger. Word spread through Salem Village like wildfire in dry grass. Mercy had spent 3 weeks visiting every family that had lost children to Brother Josiah's false promises, sharing what she had witnessed in the hidden compound. The reaction was swift and unanimous: horror, rage, and a burning desire for justice that could no longer be contained. Thomas Blackwood, whose 7 children had been taken over the past 5 years, became the unofficial leader of the group. A blacksmith by trade, he possessed both the physical strength and the moral authority needed to organize their desperate mission. Joining him were 15 other fathers and 3 mothers, including Rebecca Mills and the widow Hannah Prescott's brother, who had sworn to avenge his sister's death. "We go in tomorrow night," Thomas announced during their final planning meeting in his workshop. The sound of hammer on anvil had been replaced by the quiet intensity of men and women preparing for war. Jacob has confirmed that Brother Josiah will be conducting one of his sacred ceremonies in the main temple. Most of his guards will be occupied with that abomination. Mercy stood before the assembled group, her face illuminated by the forge's dying embers. The transformation in her appearance was striking. Where once she had been soft and submissive, she now carried herself with the deadly grace of a predator. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the workshop, "our primary goal is to rescue the children. But if Brother Josiah or any of his followers try to stop us..." She let the implication hang in the air. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would split into 3 groups, one to create a distraction at the main settlement, another to secure the hidden compound and evacuate the children, and a third to confront Brother Josiah directly. Each group carried torches, weapons, and a burning desire to end the nightmare that had consumed their families. The night of the assault arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to promise spring's eventual return. As the group made their way through the forest, Mercy found herself thinking not of revenge, but of redemption, the chance to save children who still had hope of healing from their trauma. The distraction team, led by Rebecca Mills, struck first. They set fire to several outbuildings in the main settlement, creating enough chaos to draw most of the guards away from the hidden compound. The orange glow of the flames could be seen for miles, and the sound of shouting men filled the night air. Mercy led the rescue team directly to the children's dormitory, using the same drainage tunnel she and Jacob had discovered weeks earlier. This time, however, they were prepared for what they would find. The sight of the terrified children still made her heart ache, but her resolve never wavered. "We're here to take you home," she announced as they burst into the dormitory. "You're safe now. No one will ever hurt you again." The children's reaction was heartbreaking. Many were too traumatized to understand that rescue had finally come, while others clung to their liberators with desperate hope. Mercy found Samuel huddled in his corner, and when she knelt beside him, he looked at her with confusion before recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. "Mama," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Yes, my darling boy," she said, gathering him into her arms. "Mama's here, and I'm never letting you go again." The evacuation proceeded with military precision, but as they were leading the last group of children to safety, Brother Josiah appeared with a dozen of his most fanatical followers. The prophet's face was a mask of rage and disbelief, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "You dare defile this sacred place?" he roared, his voice carrying the authority he had wielded for so many years. "These children belong to the Lord. They are consecrated vessels, not your worldly possessions." Thomas Blackwood stepped forward, his blacksmith's hammer gripped in his massive hands. "The only thing that belongs to the devil here is you, Josiah. Your reign of terror ends tonight." What followed was less a battle than an execution. Years of suppressed rage and grief exploded into violence as the parents fought to protect their children and punish those who had tormented them. Brother Josiah's followers, accustomed to terrorizing helpless victims, proved no match for desperate parents fighting for their families. The prophet himself tried to flee, but Mercy intercepted him at the entrance to his private chambers. In his hands, he carried a leather satchel filled with documents, records of his crimes, lists of children, and correspondence with other similar communities scattered across the colonies. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his smooth voice finally cracking under pressure. "I was building a new Eden, a perfect society free from the corruption of the outside world. These children were being prepared for a higher purpose." Mercy looked at him with the cold contempt reserved for the truly evil. "You were building hell on earth and calling it heaven, but your judgment has finally come." She didn't kill him herself. That honor went to Thomas Blackwood, whose hammer fell with the finality of divine justice. But she was the one who gathered his documents and ensured that every detail of his crimes would be preserved as evidence of the horrors that had been perpetrated in the name of false faith. The rescue mission saved 43 children, ranging in age from infants to teenagers. Many bore physical and emotional scars that would take years to heal, but they were alive and free. The pregnant girls were taken to sympathetic families who would care for them and their unborn children, while the younger ones were reunited with their biological parents or placed with loving adoptive families. Mercy found her infant daughter in Brother Josiah's private quarters, healthy but bearing the small brand that marked her as one of his chosen vessels. The sight of that mark filled Mercy with a rage so pure it felt like divine fire. But she channeled that anger into determination to ensure her daughter would grow up knowing only love and protection. The hidden compound was burned to the ground, its ashes scattered to the winds as a final act of purification. The main settlement of New Zion was abandoned, its buildings left to decay as a monument to the dangers of blind faith and unchecked authority. In the months that followed, word of the rescue spread throughout the colonies, inspiring other communities to investigate similar religious groups that demanded the sacrifice of children for supposed divine purposes. Several other compounds were discovered and disbanded, their victims rescued, and their leaders brought to justice. Mercy Whitmore became something of a legend, the mother who had faced down a false prophet and saved dozens of innocent lives. But she took no pleasure in the fame, preferring to focus on healing her own family and helping other survivors rebuild their shattered lives. Years later, as she watched her children play in the garden behind their new home in Boston, Mercy reflected on the journey that had brought them to safety. The scars would always remain, both physical and emotional, but they had survived. They had escaped the darkness and found their way back to the light. The Whitmore family's story became a cautionary tale told throughout New England, a reminder that evil could wear the mask of righteousness and that the greatest courage was often found in the hearts of those who had the most to lose. And in the end, it was love, not faith, not obedience, but the fierce, protective love of a mother for her children that had proven stronger than the forces of darkness that had threatened to consume them all. The shadows of New Zion had finally been banished, and in their place hope had taken root and begun to grow.